Testing one. Testing. All right. I'll just have to speak louder. Sorry for that.
Yeah, I think we're okay.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you all for having me. If you'll go ahead and turn your Bibles to the book of Daniel, we'll start there. If I didn't get to introduce myself at first, we were working with the technical issues and things, so I apologize for that, but I'm glad to be here. Thankful for the congregation here for hosting our elders preachers meeting we have every month. I've attended a few of those, and it's really enriching for all of us. Is there anything anyone wants to bring out or discuss? I don't know if you normally do announcements at this time or anything, but open the floor for that, and then I want to open with a word of prayer before we get into our study. Anything at all? All right. Let's pray together. Our gracious and merciful Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. Thank you for this time we have to glean your wisdom and from your word. Pray that every one of us would give attention to how we might live our lives in ways that glorify you and walk according to your light and your truth. We pray for all those who cannot be here, all those who are traveling, all those who are struggling or sick for whatever the reason may be. We pray that you would, we trust that you know the need, that you can do many wonderful things. Pray that everything we say and do here be pleasing in your sight, that we might wrestle with your word and come to an understanding and help guide us and according to your truth. We ask all these things in Jesus Christ's most blessed name, and amen. All right. I guess I didn't introduce myself either. I'm a 2012 graduate from the West Virginia School of Preaching, and since then I've been helping out mostly in southeastern Ohio between Gallia and Scioto counties, and sometimes over in West Virginia, just preaching by appointment since that time. I'm currently working at Ohio University, and but I came in contact with this congregation through the preachers meeting, so I really appreciate that. And I bring that up because from my days studying to be a minister, I always wanted to bring a New Testament message when it came to a Sunday morning sermon. And that's kind of been my habit and that sort of thing. But I know sometimes when I get to the Old Testament, when I go into a Sunday evening service and I give them a sermon, regardless of where it's from in the Old Testament, I fear some people have this attitude. Well, I just prefer the New Testament. I want to hear something from the New Testament. And we did a study of the book of Daniel, chapter by chapter, at Rio, the congregation at Rio Grande, Ohio. And it was after that study, or somewhere in the middle of it, one of the elders came to me and said, I've always focused on the New Testament, and I'm starting to realize that there's a lot in the Old Testament that we can learn from and is really enriching for us. So while we're New Testament Christians, I think there's a lot of things we can learn from the Old Testament. And to understand Daniel, we have to understand the timeline. Genesis gives us the history of God and man between the time of Adam, the time of Moses, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes, the 12 patriarchs, that sort of thing. For Moses, we have Joshua who leads the people, then the judges, then the kings. But at Daniel, that series of kings comes to an end, and there's a 70-year captivity. Is anyone familiar with the reason for the 70 years of captivity, where Israel was taken from Jerusalem and taken to Babylon?
Well, they basically, the entire nation rejected God, and especially from the beginning where he brought all the nation out of Egypt, took care of them, but then they started drifting away. So
Right.
they had to go through 40 years of wanderings. That was punishment for a nation that rebelled.
Right. yeah, because of their rebellion, they had 40 years of wanderings. That generation essentially died in the wilderness. So because of their unwillingness to go into the promised land where God had led them. And then we have, again, like I said, painting with broad brushes, the judges and then the kings of Israel. But then because they had neglected the Sabbaths, that's one of the reasons the 70 years is given. But because they had neglected God, they had sinned against God, God took them out of the land that he had given to them. So that's where the book of Daniel starts. Now there's 3 different deportations. There's 3 different times that people are led out of Jerusalem at this time. We have to understand the Babylonian Empire. So I'll start in chapter 1, unless anyone has any questions or comments so far. I think it's really important to set the stage. I think this is a neglected portion of Old Testament history for a lot of reasons, and though Daniel's a prophetic book and parts of it can be difficult, a lot of it's very easy to understand if we get the context. I have a note here, we're talking 606 BC, 606 years before roughly Jesus was born. And I'll be reading from the New King James. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish but good looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. So either just from that text or from your understanding, and if you don't know the name Nebuchadnezzar, then you can't really answer this, but what's our understanding of the character of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonian Empire at this time? Later on in Daniel, he'll see some things. Daniel, of course, interprets his dream, and God humbles Nebuchadnezzar. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but he was the one who threw the 3 into the burning fiery furnace and saw 4 in the burning fiery furnace, and we can talk about that later. That had an effect on him, and that seemed to change him and change his view of God, and there's even a letter written from him later on in the chapters of Daniel. At this time, at least, I don't want to paint him in that positive light. Sometimes we read those stories and we're familiar with them, but Nebuchadnezzar was not the kind and wise king when we think of him in this context. The conquering king, the one who took Jehoiakim from Israel, did horrible things to his family, blinded him and kept him captive. If you read the prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, it might be Jeremiah more so than Ezekiel, but all 3 of these prophets played a part in preaching to the people, warning them of the captivity, and then Daniel was the one who was taken as a youth into captivity and is preaching and teaching and guiding the people there. Any questions or comments so far? Another reason I think we should study the book of Daniel, because it really answers the question, how do we serve God in a nation that is completely devoted to other gods, to their king, to so many other things? And if it's not enriching for us today, I believe there's going to come a time it will be enriching for the next generation, regardless of your opinion of our nation, whether it is or wasn't a Christian nation or not. There are certain things and certain trends that we see that we have to remain faithful no matter what the culture or how we're led in these different things. And I think we'll see that when Daniel and his friends stand up against the king and their ways and their traditions in order to serve God. And we'll see that immediately following verse 5. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them, the chief of the eunuchs gave names to give Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. What was the purpose of giving them these new names and giving them this education, this training? Any ideas?
We're asking why their names were changed.
Yeah, why were their names changed and why were they given the, I mean, either question.
The Israelite names
Mhm.
all, in some way or other, carry the name of God, Jehovah God.
Mhm.
That was changed, their names were changed now to reflect more the Babylonian gods.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. I have a chart here because I would like to reference it. It's not like you go into a Spanish class and you're given a Spanish name. Like in high school, my name was Pablo in Spanish class because it's more Spanish. It just gets you immersed in that language and that culture. They're being trained to be good Babylonians. They're being trained to serve the king and do that sort of thing. And education can be a wonderful thing, but these people were ripped from their home. They were given different names. They were obviously not given certain rights and certain things that others would as natural citizens and all those things. But there is something in each of their names, and we typically refer to them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I try personally to reflect their original names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, Daniel refers to himself as Belteshazzar throughout the book, and that's how people knew him, and I don't think there's necessarily a negative context to that all the time. But your Bible might have a note. Daniel means God is my judge. Anytime you see the letters EL at the end of someone's name, that's a reference to the Lord or Elohim, as the Hebrew word is. So Daniel means God is my judge. Some people struggle spelling the name Michael, which is my middle name, so I've never struggled with it. But if you understand the EL comes at the end, it's AEL instead of the EAL. Some people switch those around, but the EL, if that helps anyone, is a reference to God. We mentioned Jeremiah, Hananiah, Azariah. The Yah at the end has something to do with the name of God. Hananiah means Jehovah has been gracious. Mishael means who is God. Jehovah has helped is what Azariah means. Now they were given names that honored the Babylonian gods like Bel or Aku, which is the moon god. Belteshazzar means protect his life, or Bel protect his life. Shadrach is the command of Aku. Meshach is who is what Aku is. Abednego is a servant of Nebo, which is some other deity, who is obviously not God, but according to their pantheon and their religion, they were bringing them in and trying to make them be good Babylonians, worship the state religion and serve the king. And they served the king for the most part, with some exception that they had to take to serve God and purpose in their heart, which we'll see. But there's something about the way that they were taken, the way that they were in the mind of the Babylonians, they were making them good citizens and good people because they're following their culture and their traditions. But there are some things that they would not do because it would cause them to fall away from God, or to not pursue those things that God had told them to do according to his law. Any questions or comments about any of that? So actually verse 8 is what I was really getting to, the point of, it's really to me the theme of the chapter. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portions of the king delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So one problem we have studying the Old Testament, if someone sets, pork or bacon or something in front of us, we have no problem partaking of that, But for Daniel and for his friends, for the king to set that before them, to set the wine before them, to set all these things before them, they had to purpose in their heart not to partake of that, not to participate in those sort of things. There are some things they probably had no problem participating in or doing or saying, but there are some things that they knew would be contrary to the law of God, and they purposed in their heart from the beginning not to defile themselves with that, even if everyone around them did so. One thing I think we miss is, how many of these youths were brought from Jerusalem, and how many of them were there? How many did the master of the eunuchs have to take care of and have to feed? And yet we only read of Daniel and his three friends purposing in their heart and saying, no, we're not going to eat this. We're not going to partake of these things. And sometimes we might think that it's a minor thing. Sometimes we might think this is a big ordeal. But if they purpose in their heart and these things and these foods and these things that are brought before them and drinking wine and whatsoever, the purpose in the heart not to do these things, it's clear that they're definitely not going to later on. They're not going to bow down before the image of the king. They're not going to stop praying just because some unfair law has been passed against them. And something that just occurred to me, I've got a note here. You don't have to turn there, but in 1 Timothy 4, and I owe this to Aaron Birch because he gave a lesson about this passage at the lectureship at the West Virginia School of Preaching a few years ago, but it really stuck with me. In 1 Timothy 4, Paul writes, I charge you therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who will judge the living and the dead at his appearing in his kingdom. That's 2 Timothy, I apologize. 1 Timothy 4. The Spirit expressly says in the latter days, some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies and hypocrisy, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from foods which God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. What he said was, we like to think of, big important doctrines that if people deny them, they've left the faith, they're outside the faith. Paul warns about people teaching things contrary to marriage and food. Simple, everyday things that we don't necessarily think about, but if they depart in those things, they're going to depart in greater things. Jesus said, if you're faithful with little, then you'll be treated with much. But if you're not faithful in those minor things, how can you be trusted with greater things? And I'm paraphrasing that horribly. But we understand the principle. Because they purposed in their heart and did not, partake in these minor things, they were able to be trusted with not succumbing to idolatry, to not succumbing to unfaithfulness to the Lord, the living God. And I think there's a principle there that we see these as minor things that don't matter to us today, but they were important to them. They purposed in their heart to follow the law of God as much as they understood and wished to follow it. Any comments or questions up to that point? So they're in a bit of a bind. They are being told to eat these things and they refuse to. So what and how are they going to get out of the situation? And we see the example following in verse 9. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And actually, I want to pause and think about that. Obviously, the text says that God brought him in the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. How can we come into the favor and goodwill of the people around us or the people that we interact with every day? Might not be something we've thought much about. I believe Daniel served God and he was kind and patient, and I believe if we exert those positive characteristics and think about those good things, that if we serve God, we can have an effect on people around us. They'll see us as trustworthy. They'll see us as dependable. They'll see us as likable. Don't get me wrong. There's a time to stand for the truth and oppose different things and things that are taught as truth. And we have to understand the balance there. But I wonder how much of Daniel's character was obviously from following God, and God did a work to allow this to happen, but how much of that depends on us understanding the the love of God and to follow God and to understand the characteristics of people who are in a relationship with God and how that can affect people's opinion of us. And that can have an impact, and that can help us out of sticky situations like Daniel was in here. Verse 10. The chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king who has appointed your food and drink, for why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. So Daniel's plan is give us 10 days, just water and vegetables, and then see how we do. And then if we look ill, then maybe we'll have to start eating these things. But if we are healthy, then we need to continue this way because we want to be faithful to God. What does that sound like to anyone? Give us 10 days, let us test this out, let's see what the outcome is. Another reason I appreciate the book of Daniel is the apologetic nature and the prophecies and things. But studying chemistry at a secular university, we watched a few TED Talks on different scientific topics and chemical topics. But one secular individual said, the first thing we have even remotely resembling a scientific experiment is in the book of Daniel. Now, as far as science is today, a bit more rigorous, a bit more defined. He didn't have this group and a control group. Well, actually he does. But anyway, you have one group eating these delicacies, and these things are contrary to the law of God, the law of Moses. You have another group eating just water and vegetables, and let's see after 10 days if one's healthier than the other or not. That's a scientific experiment. And I'm not trying to put the word science into this, I'm not being anachronistic, but there was wisdom in Daniel to discern, how we can test these things and figure out what the truth of the matter is. So the wisdom of the book of Daniel does not need to be overlooked. The book of Daniel itself doesn't need to be overlooked, and we need to glean things from the Word of God and be wise, and we can be able to help ourselves and help others to see the truth, and if we can call them to test out certain things. I just think that's a really rich, people will dismiss the book of Daniel, they'll dismiss the Bible in general or religion in general, but there's something very wise beyond the time that it was written. And this test that he proposes, this wise experiment that he proposes, if you want to call it that. Any questions or comments or anything along those lines?
Actually, what's interesting about that
Oh, go ahead.
is that realistically, they've been commanded to do something. And if it was probably anybody else, okay, the normal thing, anybody who refuses, they just take them out back. That's the end of it,
Oh, yeah.
So that was pretty, a lot of courage on his part, knowing God had his back, to be able to propose, what, instead of us doing what you want to do, how about we do this? Back in those days, you didn't see people doing that with the king too often.
Oh, absolutely.
Anybody representing the king.
Yeah, like we said, God had put them in favor with those who rule over them.
Yeah.
And we see that even in chapter 2. The king goes ahead and orders them, go slay all the astrologers, the soothsayers, the fortune tellers, the sorcerers, and the wise men of Babylon. And David asked the king guard, what's going on? The king's guard orders are to kill him. And he's like, well, this is what happened. Do you just carry out the king's orders, or do you warn Daniel and tell him, well, this is what happened, this is what we have to do? And Daniel finds a solution. So there's something about them that made them highly regarded among, the guards, among the chief of the eunuchs, the people that were over them. In spite of all this, even though they were, not trying to be rebellious for the sake of rebellion. They were just saying, we do not want to participate in this, and that sort of thing. There's a whole lot we could talk about. When it comes to chapter 3 in the burning fiery furnace, we talk about the courage of that. I hate to have to go there. The portion that people misunderstand about that, they didn't walk into the furnace knowing that they would be saved. They walked into the furnace knowing that whether God would save them or not, they were going to be faithful to him. And let's just turn over there for a moment. You're familiar with the burning fiery furnace. You're familiar with the idol that was set up. They're supposed to worship the image of the king when all the music was played. And instead of the king putting them to death, even the king at that time says, are you sure you knew about this? Are you sure it was communicated to you and you just didn't know it? He was kind to them enough that he gave them some time to say, well, if you bow down now, we'll just brush this under the rug and forget about it. Most kings wouldn't be doing that. So God clearly showed favor with them, and they were favorable in the eyes of these kings and everyone. But chapter 3, verse 16 of Daniel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. They didn't need time to deliberate. They didn't need to weigh out the pros and cons. Are we going to serve God or do what the king says? If it is the case, verse 17, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. And I think that's the fact that they face these issues, these problems time and again, there is the courage that is exemplified in their answer and their refusal to participate in these things. If it made them a good citizen, if it made them better liked in the eyes of people because this is what they did in this nation, they refuse to participate in that. So, any other questions or comments?
Hey, Kevin.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just really marvel at their faith. And I really like the way that you presented that. Because it wasn't like they knew for a fact that God's going to deliver them. They know that, because they made it 7 times hotter, they really made that furnace hot. And if you ever had a wiener roast and the wind's blowing your way, not only do you get the smoke in your face, but with that heat, on your hand, if that hot dog little stick there is kind of close to it, the fire is pretty big. And you can imagine in the furnace, it's going to be, hundreds of times hotter. And to have that faith where, hey, I don't know if God's going to deliver me or not. I might have to go in there, get burned, and then eventually die, or God could save me. I don't know which one's which. And if you knew for a fact that God's going to save you, that would be one thing. That would be, okay, well, I'm not even going to feel the heat because God's protecting me, but they didn't know that.
Absolutely.
So their faith was unbelievable.
Absolutely. This is taught in Sunday school. We get the bare bones of the story, but they really said either God will deliver us or we're going to die, but we're going to be faithful. There's no deliberation. There's no pros and cons. There's no hesitation on their part. And that's something I think that we need to consider when we can glean from studying Daniel. So I appreciate that. Any other comments or questions? Let's see. Anyone? Verse 14 we read, they tested him 10 days. Verse 15 back in Daniel chapter 1. At the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Some translations say pulse, that's just vegetables in King James language. Verse 17, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of those days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus, and that brings us to the end of the chapter. So there's something that we can glean from secular wisdom, from worldly wisdom, but yet here we see the wisdom of God excelling more than what their wisdom was. Because the chief of the eunuchs, he was first afraid that, well, if I feed you this way, if I don't feed you what everyone else is eating, then you're going to be unhealthy. You're going to be worse off than everyone. But not only were they just as healthy as the other young men, they were even healthier because they, and again, some people argue, did God work a miracle here, or did they just, I mean, you can get, on vegetarian diet, you can get a majority of your nutrients. There's Ezekiel that we could talk about, the Ezekiel bread and that sort of thing, if they balanced it with beans and different things and different proteins. But it seems like following the way of God, they were concerned that they would be worse off. They were even better off. And I think that's a dichotomy and a lesson that we need to think about. It brings me to mind 1 Corinthians. If anyone has a question or comment while I turn there. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 is what I'm thinking of. Give me a second. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 18. You don't have to turn there, but the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. For it's written, I'll destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? And in a sense, that's what happened in Daniel chapter 1. Everything they said, this is the way you should eat, this is the diet you should have, this is the regiment you should take. And because they chose to follow God, they were much better off than I think anyone could have even imagined at that point, just based off their understanding of worldly wisdom and the Babylonian wisdom. And they excelled in their education and in their, obviously 3 years have passed. The book of Daniel tells us that. About 3 years have passed from the time they were brought in to the time that they were, I believe, interviewed or whatever, presented before the king. So they had 3 years to study, and they also in that they excelled more than all the others. It's not necessarily a competition that we need to be consistently in and with being wiser than others, but at the same time, they're given an opportunity, they took advantage of it, and they showed that they were above and beyond all the others because they were faithful to God and they served God. Any questions, comments, or ideas up to that point? Okay. So yeah, chapter 2, when we get into that, and I'm not going to have a lot of time to get into it, obviously, with the time we have left. About 3 years have passed in their training, their education. This is where Nebuchadnezzar has his dream. He refuses to tell the sorcerers and the soothsayers, the magicians, the Chaldeans, which Chaldean is a group of people that lived in that area, but it seems to have a special meaning here with those who are practicing magic, sorcery, divination, that sort of thing. Anyone somewhat familiar with King Nebuchadnezzar's dream and all that it entails, besides you? I don't have a lot of time to get into it this morning, but I did mention the apologetic nature of Daniel and why it's important. I've had people challenge me, why are you a Christian? Why do you believe? And there's a whole lot of things. Maybe I spend too much time on the internet. I don't know. But there's a lot of people who, don't understand the nature of the Christian faith. They understand the nature of the Bible itself. There's a lot of misinformation floating around out there. If you understand the prophecy of Daniel chapter 2 and understand it properly, if you understand the prophecies of Daniel chapter 9, those two together come in a culmination where God establishes his kingdom on the day of Pentecost. And that's something that we can understand pretty plainly and pretty clearly, but the rest of the world misses. And a lot of religious teaching completely misunderstands the prophecy of Daniel chapter 2. And I don't have time to go into it in much detail. But if you ever understood or studied this chapter 2, you understand the four metals of the image that the king dreams about. And Daniel gives the interpretation. That's the wonderful thing about Daniel is oftentimes he will give the interpretation immediately after. There's a lot of times Jesus does the same thing with some of the parables he teaches. He gives us the interpretation, or his disciples the interpretation, and it's written down. But to understand what the interpretation is, the dream that the king has, can't make head or tails of it if it were just to be a dream that I had. There's this giant statue. It has four different metals. The top is of gold and silver, then brass, then iron and clay at the bottom. There's four different sections to the statue. This giant stone comes out of the mountain. It wasn't made by hands. It strikes the statue at the base and it destroys it. It basically pulverizes it, breaks it up into different pieces. And then that stone fills the whole earth and subdues all the kingdoms. Daniel gives the interpretation. Babylon is the first kingdom, the head of gold. There will be one that come after them, the Medo-Persian Empire. History isn't always our strong suit, but I believe this part of history needs to be understood if we're going to study the book of Daniel. After chapter 5, the Babylonian Empire comes to an end, the Medo-Persians come in. So when Daniel's thrown into the lion's den, that's actually a Medo-Persian king, not a Babylonian king. And we need to understand the difference. But we have Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, which Daniel says fills the whole earth. That's how you know it's the Greek Empire, because their span was not much smaller than the Roman Empire to come after. In the days of the Roman Empire, God is going to set up a kingdom. And actually, go ahead and read chapter 2 to make my point. Daniel 2:44, if you get nothing else from this. The days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So God's kingdom is going to be set up in the time of the Roman Empire, if you take Daniel at face value. Now, secular scholars rebel against that, but there's no other way to really properly understand it, given the nature of the kingdoms he describes. And there's so much more in Daniel that tells us about the Greek Empire, about Alexander the Great, his conquest of the Medo-Persian Empire. And again, if you're not up on your history, I understand this is a lot of information. But just to summarize Daniel chapter 2, God's kingdom will come during that fourth empire, during the time of the Roman Empire. Now we understand the day of Pentecost during the time of the Roman Empire after the death, burial, and resurrection. That's one thing. Why do I mention Daniel chapter 9? Okay, I thought I had a few more minutes. 5 minutes, okay. Daniel chapter 9 gives us the 70-week prophecy. And it's a prophecy, there is interpretations abound, but it gives you a 490-year timetable. Not from the time Daniel's writing it, but from the time they return from Babylonian captivity to the time that the Messiah is going to come. So just understand this. Regardless of when scholars say Daniel was written, whether it's 500 years before Jesus, whether it's 200 years before Jesus, he gives us the timetable of Christianity coming into existence. And the scholars that say Jesus doesn't exist, they're just begging the question. But we can ignore them and just say, look, Daniel tells us it'll happen in the Roman Empire. Daniel tells us the Messiah is going to come at that time when Jesus was crucified, and the kingdom is set up then, and the Christianity comes into existence then. You can't deny when the Old Testament was written. You can't deny the existence of Christianity when it came into being in the first century. And from a secular standpoint, this is, to me, an open and shut case. All I want to do is reject the idea of your interpretation of prophecy. But if you don't understand the apologetic nature of that, the evidential nature of that, then, because people ask me, why are you a Christian? I'll say, well, this, and this. So like, well, those are all just reasons. Like, well, listen to this and look at this. And they'll reject it out of hand, but that's why I think the apologetic nature of Daniel, the prophecies of Daniel, when I'm confronted with things I don't have an answer to, when I'm struggling, when I doubt, when I'm afraid, I can look at that and say, how can you explain that in any other way other than trying to interpret it completely differently, unnaturally, or just to put your biases into it. And you might not deal with things on that kind of level, but these prophecies should strengthen us and strengthen our faith, not just to convince others. So, are there any questions about that? Because I know that was a lot of information in a short time. Anyway, I think this book is really, really amazing and remarkable, and I think it can build our faith and help us to understand what it means to purpose in our heart and follow God. So I'll go ahead and finish there. If you want, I'll just have you go to Matthew 14 for the sermon I'll be presenting later. So thank you for your time and attention.